Welcome to the Story of Us. I'm your host, Madison Reed, and today we're embarking on an extraordinary journey through one of history's most transformative periods, a time when brave souls sailed into the unknown and literally reshaped our planet. Picture this. It's 1491, just 1 year before Columbus would change everything. If you're an educated European, you believe in magic and werewolves. You think unicorns roam distant lands, and that comets foretell the future. You're convinced the Earth sits at the center of the universe, and you believe Homer's Odyssey is historical fact. Plants get their healing properties from their God-given shapes, and the known world ends somewhere beyond the Mediterranean. But all of that is about to change. In the span of just a few centuries, humanity will undergo what historian David Wooten calls one of the most dramatic intellectual transformations in history. By the time we reach Voltaire's era, educated Europeans will embrace scientific experimentation, peer through telescopes and microscopes, worship Newton as a scientific pioneer, understand that Earth orbits the sun, and dismiss tales of magic as mere folklore. This isn't just a story about European sailors getting lost and stumbling upon new continents. It's the story of how exploration sparked a scientific revolution, created the first truly global economy, fundamentally altered human consciousness about race and identity, and set in motion forces that would shape our modern world in ways that still reverberate today. So grab your compass and let's set sail into the past. We'll journey through the major milestones of human history, from the first sparks of evolution to the breakthroughs that changed how we live, think, and connect. Along the way, you'll uncover fascinating stories about the inventions, ideas, and discoveries that shaped civilization as we know it. If you love curious, mind-opening content that makes history come alive, then you need to check out The Story of Us on Skoob, the AI-powered podcast app that delivers short, binge-worthy episodes tailored to your interests. From the invention of paper to the rise of language, cities, and science, Skoob makes learning about our shared past fast, compelling, and fun. Download Skoob from the App Store or Play Store and rediscover the stories that made us who we are. Our story begins not on the high seas, but in a castle perched on the edge of Europe, facing the endless Atlantic. In this fortress at Sagres, Portugal, a prince who would never sail around the world himself became the architect of the age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, and what a fitting name that would prove to be, had a vision that seemed almost impossible in the early 15th century. He looked out at a nation of peasant farmers and coastal fishermen and imagined transforming it into a maritime empire that would reach the furthest corners of the earth. Think about what Henry accomplished in purely human terms. As historian Daniel Borston observed, Henry managed to create something almost unheard of in his time: a collaborative national adventure. This wasn't just one brave captain setting off into the unknown. This was a systematic, methodical, national program designed to push the boundaries of the known world, step by careful step. Henry's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He would send expedition after expedition down the African coast, each one going just a little bit further than the last. Each voyage would build on the knowledge gained from the previous one. When state funding ran low, he would collaborate with private investors. It was exploration as a long-term business plan. By the time of Henry's death, his expeditions had reached roughly 1,500 miles down the western coast of Africa, all the way to what we now call Sierra Leone. But more importantly, Henry had transformed Lisbon into something extraordinary: a cosmopolitan hub bustling with international maritime culture, a place where knowledge from around the world converged and new expeditions were born. Here's what's fascinating. In 1975, Wernher von Braun, one of the architects of space exploration, visited Henry's castle at Sagres and was struck by how remarkably similar it was to what the modern space community was trying to achieve. The pioneering explorers trained under Henry's guidance, names like Bartolomeu Dias, Ferdinand Magellan, and Vasco da Gama, were like the astronauts of their day. Carl Sagan made this connection even more explicit in 1980, calling the Voyager space capsules the lineal descendants of Henry's ships. Think about that for a moment. The same spirit that drove Henry to stare out at the unknown Atlantic Ocean is the same spirit that drives us today to send probes beyond our solar system. But Henry's impact went far beyond exploration. He had unknowingly set in motion what would become the second great age of globalization. If the Mongol era, under Genghis Khan, was the first time the world was truly connected, Henry's maritime revolution would create something even more profound, a global network of trade that would, for the first time in human history, link every continent on Earth. In the century following Henry's death, regular trade would be established between all the world's major regions. Ships would carry an incredible array of goods: sugar and pepper, nutmeg and cloves, cinnamon and grain, wine and timber, gold and silver, silks and textiles, porcelain, and so much more. These vessels would transport agricultural products like tobacco and potatoes to lands where they had never been seen before. They would carry horses and pigs to new continents, but they would also carry something far more sinister and unintended: parasites and insects, diseases like malaria and smallpox that would devastate populations in the Americas, and syphilis that would travel in the opposite direction back to Eurasia. Henry's legacy echoes through the ages. Today, as we stand at the threshold of potentially establishing colonies on the Moon or Mars by the mid-21st century, we can see the same framework Henry established: the relentless quest for knowledge, a structured approach to building on previous missions, the thrill of overcoming new frontiers, and the driving ambition to venture further, even when the immediate returns aren't guaranteed. As a 2014 Financial Times editorial declared, "Our manifest destiny is to move beyond Earth." Henry would have understood that sentiment perfectly. With Henry's foundation laid, let's follow the most crucial voyage in this entire saga, a journey that would literally unlock the door to the East and change the course of world history forever. By 1471, Portuguese navigators had accomplished something remarkable. They had crossed the equator and navigated the Gulf of Guinea without the catastrophic consequences that medieval scholars had predicted. No, they didn't burst into flames from the heat. No, they didn't fall off the edge of the earth. They just kept sailing. In 1482, they reached the mouth of the Congo River. But the real breakthrough came 6 years later, when Bartholomew Diaz navigated around the southern tip of Africa. Picture the drama of this moment. Diaz, battered by fierce storms and treacherous winds, names this treacherous point the Cape of Storms. But when he returns to Portugal, the king, recognizing the monumental significance of what Diaz has achieved, renames it the Cape of Good Hope. Why? Because this cape represented hope for a sea route to the riches of the East. Enter Vasco da Gama, a name that would become legendary. In July 1497, commanding a small fleet of just 4 vessels, da Gama departed Lisbon on what would become one of the most consequential voyages in human history. Here's what's remarkable about this journey. After passing the Cape Verde Islands, da Gama made a bold decision. Instead of hugging the African coast like previous explorers, he veered widely into the South Atlantic. For 5 months. 5 months. His ships saw no land. Imagine the courage, the faith, the sheer determination required to sail into the unknown Atlantic for that long, trusting that they would eventually find their way to the Cape of Good Hope. But da Gama's genius wasn't just in his navigation, it was in his cultural adaptability. When he reached Africa's eastern coastline, he employed a Muslim pilot to navigate the Indian Ocean crossing. This wasn't European arrogance, this was practical wisdom. Da Gama understood that local knowledge was invaluable. In May 1498, nearly a year after departing Lisbon, da Gama arrived at Calicut on India's southwest coast, one of the most important trading cities in the world. He had done it. He had opened a sea route to the east. When da Gama returned to Lisbon over 2 years later, he brought with him something that would justify every risk, every hardship, every doubt. A cargo that not only covered the expedition's expenses, but generated enormous profits. The Portuguese king immediately named him Admiral of the Indies and showered him with honors. But here's the crucial context that made da Gama's voyage so perfectly timed. The Ottoman Empire was simultaneously disrupting the traditional land-based trade routes to the east. The Turks' expansion through Asia Minor and southeastern Europe in the 15th century had already blocked Italian access to northern trade routes via the Aegean and Black Seas. Later, Ottoman conquests of Syria and Egypt in the 16th century would give them control over central and southern trade passages, devastating the economic fortunes of Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, which had long dominated Oriental trade. Da Gama's sea route offered a way around all of this. Portugal could now bypass the Ottoman Empire entirely and trade directly with the source of Eastern goods. The Portuguese moved quickly to capitalize on this opportunity. Under the brilliant leadership of Viceroy Afonso de Albuquerque, they captured Goa, transforming it into the heart of Portugal's Indian Empire. Albuquerque also captured Malacca on the Malay Peninsula and Ormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, effectively giving Portugal control over the main Indian Ocean trade routes. Their reach extended even further. The Portuguese established commerce with distant China via Macau and accidentally discovered Japan in 1542. By the mid-16th century, Portugal had established substantial dominance over southern Asia and the adjacent islands. Da Gama's achievement was so monumental that it inspired Luis de Camões to write the Lusíads, an epic poem that has been called the most triumphant of modern epic narratives. This wasn't just Portuguese propaganda. This was recognition that something world-changing had occurred. The sea gates to the east were now wide open, and the world would never be the same. Da Gama's voyage didn't just open a new trade route, it triggered a fundamental reordering of global power that we're still living with today. Before Columbus's discovery in 1492, the Mediterranean and Baltic Seas were the highways of international commerce. Venice, Genoa, Hamburg, Lübeck, and Bruges were the great trading capitals of the world. But the opening of America and the sea route around Africa to the Indies changed everything virtually overnight. Suddenly, the Atlantic Ocean became the new center of world trade and commerce. The great Mediterranean ports that had dominated commerce for centuries began their slow decline, gradually ceding their trading prominence to cities along the Atlantic coast. Lisbon, Cadiz, Bordeaux, Cherbourg, Antwerp, Amsterdam, London, and Liverpool. The year 1492 didn't just mark the discovery of America. It marked the beginning of an Atlantic-centric era in European history that would last for centuries. And here's a thought that should give us pause. Just as the focus of world trade shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, we may be witnessing another westward shift today, this time toward the Pacific Ocean. But the transformation wasn't just geographic, it was economic on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The opening of America introduced Europeans to unprecedented sources of precious metals. Spanish conquests quickly yielded vast quantities of gold seized from the indigenous peoples of Mexico and Peru, wealth that had been accumulated over centuries. The discovery in 1545 of the extraordinarily rich silver mines at Potosi, Bolivia, had an even more profound effect. By the end of the 16th century, these New World mines had produced at least 3 times the amount of gold and silver that had been circulating in Europe at the century's beginning. Think about what this meant in practical terms. The medieval period had suffered from a chronic shortage of currency to fuel economic transactions. Suddenly, the dawn of the modern era saw the world flooded with the essential medium of exchange. But Spain, remarkably, couldn't hold on to this wealth. With few domestic industries, Spain essentially became a conduit, using the precious metals to pay for imported European goods and effectively distributing American wealth throughout the rest of Europe. This influx of money caused inflation, prices rose, wages increased correspondingly, and capital became available for manufacturers and traders, spurring economic activity across Europe. Where the medieval world had been constrained by lack of currency, the modern world suddenly had the financial fuel it needed for expansion. But the transformation extended far beyond economics. The Atlantic Ocean had become the new arena for both commerce and politics. The nations with Atlantic coastlines, first Portugal and Spain, then Holland, France, and England, rose to become the dominant European powers. Their trade rivalries and competitions for colonial territories would be major causes of European conflicts for the next 4 centuries. This shift had profound political implications. The balance of power in Europe was fundamentally altered. Mediterranean powers found themselves increasingly marginalized as Atlantic powers rose to prominence. The future would belong to nations that could project naval power across vast oceans, not just those that controlled traditional land-based trade routes. Perhaps most remarkably, this transformation was just the beginning. The sudden revelation of vast oceans, diverse islands, and enormous new continents covering a substantial portion of the globe sparked a revolution in geographical understanding. The realization that Earth was far larger than previously conceived fired human imagination about the possibilities for future exploration. From the 16th century well into the 20th, exploration efforts would continue until virtually every region on Earth was charted and mapped. The European encounter with new and exotic plants, animals, and peoples would mark the transition from medieval superstition to scientific knowledge, heralding the dawn of modern understanding of our world. The great shift had begun, and there was no turning back. Here's where our story takes a crucial turn, because the narrative of exploration that we've inherited is deeply flawed. We've been told that the age of exploration was fundamentally a European phenomenon, brave European sailors venturing into unknown waters to discover new lands. But this Eurocentric view misses a far more complex and fascinating reality. While European navigators were indeed pushing across the Atlantic, equally remarkable explorations and expansions were happening simultaneously around the globe. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, was conducting their own age of discovery, expanding both eastward and into Europe during this exact same period. The Ottoman conquest of regions in North Africa opened up significant maritime routes, extending into the Red Sea and beyond into the Indian Ocean. This wasn't a minor maritime venture. This was part of a long-established and dynamic network that had historically connected Southeast and South Asia, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa, with influences reaching as far as China, Japan, and Oceania. The Ottomans were rapidly expanding along the northwestern coast of the Indian Ocean, strategically occupying locations like Aden, Mocha, and Basra, creating new gateways to the east. They conquered coastal regions in Sudan and Eritrea. While their control over these territories often depended on precarious alliances with local leaders, the Ottomans were gathering considerable information about distant peoples and regions, including southern India, Sri Lanka, and Malacca. Meanwhile, the Solomonic dynasty in Christian Ethiopia was consolidating and extending its influence throughout the Horn of Africa during the early 15th century. The Ethiopian kings, known as Nugsnegest, wielded authority over a vast political entity and were dispatching diplomatic missions to numerous European cities, including Venice, Rome, Valencia, and Lisbon. Here's what's fascinating. Contrary to Western academic assumptions, these Ethiopian missions weren't about seeking European technology or military aid. They were expressions of a robust and ambitious power, presenting itself as equal to other contemporary global powers. This confidence was dramatically evident in the 1440s, when Pope Eugene IV invited the Ethiopian emperor, known to Europeans as Prester John, to attend the Council of Florence, aimed at healing schisms within the Christian Church. The Ethiopian response was remarkable for its independence and dismissiveness. When envoy Petros met the Pope in 1441, the message was clear. The Ethiopian Church had not faltered under intimidation, heresy, or poor leadership like others. They boldly criticized previous pontiffs for 800 years of neglect, illustrating Ethiopia's sovereign self-perception. But perhaps the most remarkable exploration that predated European oceanic voyages was happening in Oceania. Long before European navigators set sail across the Atlantic, sailors in the Pacific Islands were routinely undertaking extensive voyages spanning thousands of kilometers in double-hulled canoes. These weren't occasional desperate journeys. These were regular voyages across what has been beautifully described as a sea of islands, creating a rich tapestry of interconnected societies bound together by shared histories, ecologies, and resources. The increased exchanges in the Indian Ocean, particularly along the East African coast, highlighted a time of heightened interactions dating back to the mid-14th century. What this reveals is that the traditional narrative of European discovery misses the crucial point. Exploration, expansion, and the creation of far-flung networks was happening globally during this period. Europeans weren't uniquely gifted explorers stumbling upon passive, isolated societies. They were entering into and competing with existing networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that had been operating for centuries. This broader perspective doesn't diminish European achievements, but it places them in their proper context as part of a global phenomenon of expansion and connection. The age of exploration wasn't just European, it was truly global, with multiple civilizations simultaneously pushing their boundaries and expanding their horizons. Understanding this helps us appreciate that the world Columbus discovered wasn't empty or waiting to be found. It was already connected, already explored, already home to sophisticated societies with their own histories of expansion and discovery. Now let's turn to perhaps the most dramatic and consequential European expansion, the Spanish conquest of the Americas, which would create an empire that lasted nearly 300 years and fundamentally shaped the culture and society of much of the Western Hemisphere. The conquest began with Hernando Cortés' audacious overthrow of the Aztec Empire, achieved with crucial support from indigenous allies. This victory delivered numerous large towns, approximately 500 villages, and vast amounts of treasure into Spanish hands. Mexico, or New Spain, as it became known, emerged as the most significant Spanish territory in the Americas. Simultaneously, Francisco Pizarro led a small contingent of soldiers into Peru and successfully overthrew the Incan Empire. Pizarro established Lima as Peru's new capital, replacing Cusco and serving as the center of Spanish rule in South America. But here's where the story becomes almost mythical. Spanish explorers became captivated by tales of El Dorado, a legendary king who supposedly coated himself in gold dust during annual religious rituals. This sparked Spanish imagination about a fantastical land in South America, endowed with precious metals and gemstones. The search for El Dorado led to remarkable geographical discoveries. It contributed to the exploration of the Amazon and Orinoco valleys and the vast forested regions east of the Andes. The quest extended into North America, leading to Hernando de Soto's discovery of the Mississippi River in 1541 and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's journey in pursuit of the Seven Cities of Cibola, which greatly enhanced geographic knowledge of the American Southwest. By around 1605, the Spanish had founded Santa Fe as the capital of their New Mexico territory. The Spanish colonial empire eventually included Florida, New Mexico, California, Mexico, Central America, the West Indies, and nearly all of South America except Brazil. But Spanish colonization was far more complex than simple conquest and exploitation. Due to the scarcity of Spanish women in these new lands, intermarriage with indigenous populations became customary, giving rise to a mixed-race population that characterizes much of Spanish America today. Importantly, the indigenous element predominated in this mixture, because indigenous communities were generally far more numerous than European settlers. The treatment of indigenous peoples varied dramatically by region. In the West Indies, the Spanish subjected indigenous populations to harsh labor in gold mines and sugar plantations, leading to near extinction of local populations shortly after European arrival. However, on the mainland, this catastrophic depopulation wasn't replicated. The Spanish government intervened to protect indigenous peoples, imposing laws prohibiting their enslavement and offering protection through humane legislation. While these laws weren't always consistently enforced, indigenous peoples in regions like Mexico and Peru often thrived under Spanish rule as traders, farmers, and artisans. The Spanish earned the conversion of numerous indigenous peoples to Christianity through an extensive missionary system. Devout missionaries ventured into remote areas, introducing not only Christianity, but also elements of European civilization. Indigenous communities were organized into settled congregations called missions, each centered on a church and school. Converts who acquired literacy sometimes advanced to become priests or joined religious orders. The missionaries also focused on practical improvements, teaching enhanced techniques in agriculture, construction, spinning, weaving, and cooking. Some of the most famous Spanish missions were established in what is now California, where Franciscan friars constructed no fewer than 18 mission stations stretching along the Pacific coast, from San Diego to San Francisco, in the final quarter of the 18th century. These missions were connected by the King's Road, a thoroughfare that remains one of California's main highways today. Well-preserved sites like the Mission of Santa Barbara still evoke images of a Benedictine monastery with shaded cloisters, secluded courtyards, and red tile roofs, a fragment of old-world tradition transported to the New World. Spain's civilizational contributions are often overlooked. Under Spanish governance, the Americas saw some of its first hospitals and asylums, serving indigenous and African populations alongside the Spanish. The establishment of early American schools and colleges was another significant contribution. During the colonial period, 12 institutions of higher learning modeled on the University of Salamanca were founded in Spanish America. Remarkably, 8 existed before Harvard University was founded in 1636. The first printing press in the Western Hemisphere was introduced to Mexico City in 1535, over a century before those in English colonies. Spanish scholars provided critical insights into Maya, Aztec, and other indigenous cultures. The first American newspaper was published in 1693 in Mexico City. Spanish colonies fostered fine arts that later influenced United States architects. However, Spanish colonial policy was largely monopolistic. Spain prevented French, English, and other foreign entities from trading with Spanish America. The colonial administration discouraged shipbuilding, manufacturing, and even cultivation of crops like vines and olives that might compete with Spanish industry. Colonies were viewed primarily as sources of precious metals and raw materials, a short-sighted policy that contributes to ongoing economic challenges in countries like Mexico and Peru, where vast natural resources remain largely untapped. This tension between cultural contribution and economic exploitation would define the Spanish colonial experience and shape the Americas for centuries to come. Human milestones aren't just moments in time, they're clues to how we think, solve problems, and grow as a species. From the invention of paper to the first sparks of evolution, these turning points reveal how we've shaped the world, and how it's shaped us in return. If you're sitting there thinking, "How did I never learn this before?" You're not alone. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to The Story of Us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Your inner history lover will thank you. Returning to the age of exploration, what happened after 1492 wasn't just political or economic. It was one of the most profound ecological transformations in human history. Alfred Crosby recognized this when he noted that American crops like corn and potatoes literally revolutionized global agriculture and population patterns. But we're not just talking about the spread of new foods. We're talking about a complete ecological revolution characterized by the systematic exploitation and consumption of natural resources on a global scale. This transformation fundamentally altered landscapes, ecosystems, and human settlement patterns through the massive deployment of labor for planting, harvesting, extracting, and shipping goods to markets worldwide. Consider the journey of sugar, initially a luxury accessible only to the elite. Sugar cultivation began on Atlantic plantations on Madeira, the Canary Islands, and São Tomé. The Flemish and Dutch then introduced it to Brazil, and it spread throughout Caribbean islands, reaching new production heights in Louisiana and predominantly Cuba by the 19th century. Java, in present-day Indonesia, became another major sugar production hub, alongside Taiwan and emerging centers in Mauritius, Réunion, and Fiji. Sugar was just one commodity among many. Cotton, coffee, cacao, rubber, timber, and furs all followed similar trajectories of massive exploitation. This expansion relied on four interconnected factors. First, the forcible occupation of land, often accompanied by violence, leading to conversion of the most fertile lands for cash crop production. Second, the need for substantial labor forces for plantation cultivation and resource extraction. Third, establishing logistical infrastructure for transporting goods with institutional frameworks to safeguard property rights. Finally, markets with growing demand and financial capacity. The impact on global population was staggering. When corn was introduced to African diets, it contributed to population growth that inadvertently fueled the slave trade to the Americas. Similarly, potatoes spurred a population boom in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, which subsequently pushed waves of European emigration to the Americas and Australia. These American crops were instrumental in the rise of Northern European powers like Britain, Germany, and Russia, shifting power away from Mediterranean regions. But the ecological exchange wasn't limited to crops. Ships inadvertently carried parasites and insects, spreading diseases like malaria and smallpox between Eurasia and the Americas, while transmitting syphilis from the Western Hemisphere back to Eurasia. The death toll was catastrophic. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of indigenous American populations died from diseases in the century following contact. The economic implications were equally revolutionary. Adam Smith noted in 1776 that Columbus's discovery of America and Vasco da Gama's opening of the Eastern Sea Route were the two most momentous events in human history, uniting distant parts of the world into a network of supply and consumption. However, Smith wasn't naive about the consequences. He clearly observed that European military superiority enabled them to exploit these opportunities mercilessly, committing acts of injustice in distant lands with impunity. The influx of precious metals from America supported the ideas of Marx and Engels about the propulsion of commerce, navigation, and industry. While capitalism as an economic system likely predated these events, American wealth played a crucial role in its development. The newfound finances enabled a societal shift where wealth based on gold and silver began to supplant land as the primary measure of power and status, empowering a new merchant class that would soon exert global dominance. The economic transformation also shifted global power dynamics, undermining Islamic states that had once challenged Europe. The resulting 400% inflation devalued economies outside Europe and helped establish a European-dominated global marketplace. Africa suffered greatly as the once thriving trans-Saharan trade dwindled. The Americas offered more gold and silver than the Gold Coast could provide. Consequently, Africa's primary remaining tradable asset became human labor in the form of slaves. More than 200 medicinal remedies have roots in plants whose uses were first identified by Native Americans. The Americas introduced Europeans to maize and potatoes, the latter dubbed the bread of the poor, due to its widespread cultivation in Europe. Other New World commodities like chocolate, cocoa, Peruvian bark, with its quinine content for treating malaria, cochineal, Brazilian dyewoods, and West Indian mahogany became integral to European life. Europe received copious shipments of sugar products, fish, whale oil, and furs. Tobacco, first encountered by Columbus among native tribes, quickly spread across Europe and eventually globally. Each of these products was incorporated into everyday life, enhancing living standards in European nations while fundamentally altering global ecosystems and human societies. This ecological revolution created what we might recognize as the first truly global economy, but it came at an enormous cost in human suffering and environmental destruction that we're still reckoning with today. The age of exploration didn't just change geography and economics, it sparked an intellectual revolution that gave birth to modern science itself. When European navigators ventured beyond familiar shores into uncharted territories, they encountered unfamiliar constellations in the southern hemisphere, diverse peoples, religions, political systems, flora, and fauna that had never been described in classical texts. This flood of new information profoundly impacted education, science, and religion throughout Europe. Francis Bacon, writing in 16th century England, argued that science and philosophy shouldn't depend solely on ancient texts, but should emulate explorers by actively seeking new insights. He declared that the opening up of nature through frequent voyages lit the way for new philosophical understanding. Joseph Glanville echoed this in 1661, suggesting that undiscovered realms of nature remained, like America's secrets or an uncharted Peru, waiting to be explored. David Wooten, a contemporary historian of the scientific revolution, argues that the concept of discovery was crucial for the advent of modern science. Rather than relying solely on existing accounts, scholars should study the natural world directly. Bacon proposed that mastery over nature could be achieved by understanding and obeying it, encapsulating the proactive nature of modern science and technology. By the 17th century, many intellectuals recognized their participation in an intellectual, geographical, and commercial revolution. A Royal Society member declared in 1674 that their aim wasn't to refurbish old ideas, but to construct entirely new ones from scratch. Consider the dramatic transformation in worldview that Wooten illustrates. In Shakespeare's era, educated Europeans believed in magic, werewolves, unicorns, a geocentric universe, prophetic comets, medicinal plant shapes guided by divine design, and the historical truth of Homer's Odyssey. By Voltaire's time, educated Europeans embraced scientific experimentation, used telescopes, microscopes, and air pumps, revered Newton as a pioneering scientist, understood heliocentrism, dismissed magic and myth, and believed firmly in the advancement of knowledge. This surge of new information became the foundation for developing entirely new types of knowledge. Isaac Newton, for example, benefited from unprecedented access to diverse data as he formulated his laws of gravity. He could compare the behavior of pendulums across various regions, Paris, the Americas, and Africa, an opportunity no previous generation of scientists had experienced. Newton's achievements were significantly bolstered by the widespread increase in available knowledge generated by European exploration and trade. The ability to make generalizations about the natural world and arrive at universal scientific principles was largely facilitated by the vast amounts of information that European expeditions gathered. This wasn't just about collecting specimens or mapping new territories. The encounter with radically different environments, peoples, and natural phenomena forced European thinkers to question fundamental assumptions about the world. If people in the Americas had never heard of Christianity, what did that mean for religious truth? If plants and animals existed that weren't mentioned in classical texts, what did that mean for ancient authority? The Enlightenment that dawned in the 18th century saw European intellectuals increasingly finding meaning, purpose, and progress in the acquisition of new knowledge. The notion that humanity should actively transform and enhance the world began to permeate science, ethics, economics, philosophy, commerce, and politics. This intellectual transformation was profound. Where medieval thinking had been largely concerned with interpreting existing knowledge and authority, the new scientific approach emphasized observation, experimentation, and the systematic accumulation of new knowledge. The very concept of progress, the idea that human knowledge and condition could continuously improve, emerged from this period. The wealth of knowledge generated by exploration instilled confidence in thinkers like Newton, enabling them to make groundbreaking strides in understanding the natural universe. The scientific revolution wasn't just about individual genius, it was about having access to a vastly expanded dataset about the natural world. This transformation marked the transition from medieval superstition to modern scientific understanding. The European encounter with new and exotic plants, animals, and peoples provided the empirical foundation for the scientific method and the modern understanding of our world. The age of exploration had literally expanded human consciousness, providing the intellectual raw materials for the scientific revolution that would reshape how we understand reality itself. Now we must confront the most troubling aspects of this age of discovery: the human cost and the birth of modern racial consciousness that would haunt the world for centuries. The introduction of the Americas to European consciousness fundamentally changed perceptions of race in ways that still shape our world today. Prior to 1492, the concept of white as a distinct racial category didn't exist in Europe. People identified as Tuscans, French, English, or by other regional or national terms. But the onset of the transatlantic slave trade, originally involving Native Americans and subsequently Africans, nurtured a racial consciousness that Europeans had never possessed. Europeans began to see themselves as white and started considering race a crucial human characteristic. This wasn't a natural or inevitable development. It was a direct result of the encounter with the Americas and the subsequent need to justify exploitation and enslavement. Christopher Columbus's own writings provide a disturbing example of this psychological transformation. Initially, trying to impress Queen Isabella with the novelties of the New World, Columbus portrayed Native Americans as intelligent and well-mannered. He admired their customs and noted their curiosity and sharp memory. But when Columbus later needed to defend his violent campaigns and enslavement of native populations, he described the same people as cruel and stupid, contrasting their culture and beliefs unfavorably with those of Europeans. This shift illustrates what social psychologist Leon Festinger identified as cognitive dissonance. People prefer to maintain a positive self-image and experience psychological tension when their actions conflict with that image. The easiest resolution is often to change attitudes rather than behavior. The encounter with America also sparked European self-awareness in unprecedented ways. Shakespeare captured this fascination in The Tempest, noting that people were more inclined to pay money to see something as exotic as a dead Indian, rather than help a local beggar. Prior to 1492, there was no unified concept of Europe as a cultural or political entity. After the discovery of America, Europeans began recognizing their commonalities in contrast with Native Americans. The human cost of this new global system was staggering. The discussion here isn't merely about increased crop availability, but about a profound global transformation characterized by the systematic exploitation of natural resources and human labor. This transformation arose from the widespread deployment of forced labor necessary for planting, harvesting, extracting, and shipping goods to distant markets. The development of vast plantations required four interconnected factors. First, the forcible occupation of land, often accompanied by violence, converting the most fertile areas for cash crop production. Second, the need for substantial labor forces for cultivation and extraction. Third, establishing logistical infrastructure for transport, with institutional frameworks protecting property rights. Finally, markets with growing demand and financial capacity. The transatlantic slave trade became integral to this system. Some historians argue that American goods and products fueled the Industrial Revolution and Europe's economic ascent. Adam Smith noted in 1776 that the discovery of America and the Eastern Sea Route were monumental events that united distant parts of the world into a supply and consumption network stimulating industrial activities. However, Smith wasn't naive about wealth distribution. He clearly observed that European military superiority enabled merciless exploitation, with Europeans committing acts of injustice in distant lands with impunity. The economic transformation had profound consequences for Africa. The influx of American precious metals shifted economic power, undermining regions that had once competed with Europe. The resulting inflation devalued economies outside Europe and helped establish a European-dominated global marketplace. As anthropologist Jack Weatherford noted, Africans became victims of the discovery of America as surely as Native Americans did. Africa suffered enormously as the once thriving trans-Saharan trade dwindled. The Americas offered more gold and silver than the Gold Coast could provide. Consequently, Africa's primary remaining tradable asset became human beings. Millions of Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas under horrific conditions to provide the labor force that made colonial plantations profitable. The profound influence of America on European development often goes unnoticed due to entrenched Eurocentrism. Many European writers and historians have traditionally undervalued contributions from other cultures, whether Arab astronomers, African navigators, or American Indian societal structures. This narrow perspective means history textbooks often gloss over substantial changes and contributions from these cultures. They rarely invite reflection on how mainland Indian societies, once renowned for their wealth and cities, were reduced to impoverished conditions. They overlook how vital America was in shaping the modern world, not just as a passive landmass awaiting European conquest, but as an active ingredient in forming contemporary global dynamics. Understanding these connections provides a more comprehensive view of how our current global system developed. Appreciating the significant but often overlooked influence of the Americas in forming the modern dynamics we experience today, including the tragic legacy of racial thinking and systematic exploitation that we're still struggling to overcome. As we reach the end of our journey through the age of exploration, it's worth reflecting on how the patterns established 500 years ago continue to shape our world today. The framework that Prince Henry established at his castle in Sagres, the relentless quest for knowledge, structured approaches to building on previous missions, the thrill of overcoming new frontiers, and the driving ambition to venture further even when immediate returns aren't guaranteed, echoes powerfully in our modern exploration efforts. Today, humanity continues to explore new frontiers with remarkable parallels to the age we've been examining. In the cosmic realm, we've landed on asteroids, sent humans into space for extended periods exceeding a year, discovered new planets, and dispatched space probes beyond our solar system. An increasing coalition of countries and corporations actively pool resources in terms of talent, financial backing, research, and crowdsourced knowledge. Driven by lucrative commercial incentives, entire industries are emerging, with speculation that colonies could be established on the Moon or Mars by the mid-21st century. While the specifics remain uncertain, just as the exact progression of earlier European explorations was unclear even to Henry, the trajectory and momentum remain compelling. In our oceans, humanity is in the initial stages of cataloging the astonishing biodiversity and natural resources located far beneath the surface. In these endeavors, we can observe Henry's framework, the relentless quest for knowledge, structured building on previous insights, the thrill of overcoming geographical barriers, and the ambition to venture further. But we must also learn from the darker legacies of the age of exploration. The systematic exploitation of resources and people, the development of racial hierarchies to justify oppression, and the environmental destruction that accompanied global expansion offer sobering lessons for our current age of exploration. The same spirit that drove Europeans to cross unknown oceans now drives us to explore space and the deep ocean. But we have the opportunity to do better this time, to explore and expand while respecting the rights and dignity of all people, protecting environments, and ensuring that the benefits of discovery are shared more equitably. The age of exploration fundamentally reshaped human consciousness about what was possible. Before 1492, the world seemed smaller, more constrained, more predictable. The discovery of vast new continents, the establishment of global trade networks, and the encounter with radically different peoples and environments expanded human imagination about the possibilities for future exploration and achievement. This expansion of human consciousness may be the most lasting legacy of the Age of Exploration. It established the idea that the world was not fixed and limited, but expandable and full of possibilities. It created the modern concept of progress, the belief that human knowledge and conditions could continuously improve through exploration, discovery, and innovation. Today, as we stand at the threshold of potentially becoming a spacefaring civilization, we're following patterns established by those early explorers. We're driven by similar motivations: the quest for knowledge, the search for resources, the desire for expansion, and the fundamental human drive to explore the unknown. But we also have the benefit of historical perspective. We can see both the remarkable achievements and the terrible costs of the first age of exploration. We can choose to embrace the spirit of discovery while rejecting the exploitation and oppression that too often accompanied it. The Age of Exploration teaches us that human beings are fundamentally explorers, and that our greatest achievements often come from pushing beyond the boundaries of the known world. But it also teaches us that how we explore matters as much as what we discover. As we venture into space, as we probe the depths of our oceans, as we push the boundaries of scientific knowledge, we carry with us both the inspiring legacy of those early explorers and the sobering lessons of their failures. The Age of Exploration never really ended. It just expanded beyond our planet. The same curiosity that drove Prince Henry to stare out at the unknown Atlantic, the same courage that carried Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope, the same sense of possibility that inspired Columbus to sail west into the unknown. These fundamental human drives continue to shape our world today. But perhaps most importantly, the Age of Exploration reminds us that exploration and discovery are not just about individual achievement or national glory. They're about expanding human knowledge and capability in ways that can benefit all of humanity. The challenge for our current age of exploration is to fulfill that promise while learning from the mistakes of the past. The world became one during the Age of Exploration, connected by trade routes and cultural exchanges that persist today. Now, as we reach beyond our world to the stars, we have the opportunity to take all of humanity with us, not just the privileged few, but everyone, as we write the next chapter in the continuing story of human exploration and discovery. And so, our journey through the Age of Exploration comes to an end, but the story itself never really ends. From Prince Henry's castle overlooking the Atlantic to Vasco da Gama's arrival in India, from Columbus's first glimpse of the New World to the missions of California, from the scientific revolution to the birth of racial consciousness, we've traced the threads of a transformation that quite literally created the modern world. The Age of Exploration was many things: an age of remarkable courage and devastating brutality, of scientific enlightenment and cultural destruction, of unprecedented global connection and tragic human exploitation. It expanded human consciousness while creating new forms of oppression. It brought the world together while dividing it along racial lines that persist today. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is this: it proved that human beings are not content to remain within the boundaries of the known world. We are explorers by nature, driven by curiosity, ambition, and an irrepressible desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. Today, as we prepare to become a spacefaring species, as we probe the mysteries of the deep ocean, as we push the boundaries of scientific knowledge, we are still following the path blazed by those early navigators. We are still driven by the same fundamental human impulse that sent Portuguese ships down the African coast and Spanish conquistadors across the Pacific. The question is not whether we will continue to explore. That seems to be hardwired into human nature. The question is whether we can learn from the past to explore more wisely, more justly, and more sustainably than our predecessors. The Age of Exploration changed everything. Now it's our turn to change everything again. But this time, perhaps, we can do it better. I'm your host, Madison Reed, and this has been The Story of Us. Thanks for joining me as we uncovered the remarkable moments, discoveries, and ideas that helped shape human history. If this episode got you thinking, opened your eyes to something new, or made you curious to learn more, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And if you're hungry for more quick, insightful stories, from the origins of writing and evolution to the inventions that changed the world, check out Skoob, the AI-powered podcast studio app. Download it today from the App Store or Play Store and experience history in a faster, smarter, more engaging way. Until next time, remember, every discovery we've made is a step in the story of us. Keep exploring,